Hey guys, what is up? Welcome to the live stream tonight. Brandon Hicks here with the Orange Guild. If you haven't already, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button right now for more of these live streams. I'm live every Friday night at 7 p.m. Very happy to be here talking with you guys and chatting about Blender stuff. Before we jump in tonight, there's some announcements I want to make about what is going on, and just to keep you guys updated on things in the Blender world and also going on with the Orange Guild. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening. The Blender conference was last weekend. If you don't know what that is, basically once a year, the Blender devs meet in Amsterdam, which is the home of the Blender Foundation, where Blender was created. And all of the people that are involved with Blender, kind of gather for a yearly summit and talk about new features and what exciting things have been going on with Blender for the past year. So if you want to see those videos, those are recorded and uploaded on the main Blender YouTube channel. So I would recommend going to check those out because they're amazing and they give you some really good insights into what is coming up in Blender. As far as the Orange Guild goes, I'm working very hard behind the scenes on some cool projects. Some of those I can't talk about right now. Some of those I can. So let me talk about a couple of things before we get jumping into tonight's live stream. What I think are going to be exciting for you guys. So over the past several months, I've been working on a project about 3D illustration. Originally, it was going to be a course, and it has kind of ballooned into a new project at this point, which I'm hoping to release in November, which is going to be a boot camp. So if you guys aren't familiar with what boot camps are, they are much more intensive and mentorship based. And instead of it just being a course that you kind of go through at your own pace, mentorships allow you to kind of take on a little bit more responsibility and accountability through somebody kind of guiding you through the course week by week. So we're going to be launching an illustration boot camp, a 3D illustration boot camp in Blender, and that's going to be in November coming up. So be on the lookout for some emails coming your way about that. If you have already taken the survey that I sent out, I really appreciate you guys doing that because it's just giving me so much feedback that I can use on what to do inside the course, and then future things I can do as well. I will be providing some more details about new features and things like that coming up soon, week by week, in features on the live streams and also new videos being uploaded to the channel. Okay, so that said, tonight I'm actually doing some topics that are related to some of the things that you guys gave me in the survey answers. So Lorian had mentioned that she wanted to take a look at doing some water effects, such as water droplets and waves and ripples and things like that. So we're going to talk about how to get some of that done. Some of that's going to be probably something we're going to save for tutorials because I'll have to put a little bit more work into editing that and creating some things that are not live, just due to the nature of simulations and things that can crash live streams. So we're going to do what we can tonight, but I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to give me some feedback for what you want to learn next. So if you want to drop a comment, if you're watching this later, just go ahead and drop a comment in the video below, or any comments in any of these videos to let me know which topics you want to see in the live streams. And I reply to every comment that's being posted, let you guys know that I'm listening, and would love to hear what you guys want to learn and discuss. So let's jump into tonight's topic. Let me go ahead and switch my monitor over here. Okay. So we are still going to be in Blender 2.79 tonight, but the beta for Blender 2.8 is coming out very soon. So if you're looking for 2.8 stuff that's coming your way before the end of the year, we're going to be probably getting into that. But tonight, let's talk about how to do some water effects. So there's a few things we can start trying tonight, and let's just start simple. I'm going to do some water droplets, and then we can talk about how to get those set up basically. And then I'll talk a little bit about different methods we can use for animation and some things like that. So let's just start simple. I'm going to use a cube, and I'm going to use, let's do a subsurf modifier. And I'm just going to model a really simple droplet here that we can use. Okay. And I just want something kind of like a teardrop shape here to get this going. Now I'm gonna go ahead and turn off. If you guys have watched my live streams before, you know I don't really like to have the grid and all the stuff showing in the 3D viewport. So I'm gonna turn all that off, and let's go ahead and smooth shade this. And it's not super important to get this looking perfect right away, but I'm gonna go ahead and just try to do what I can here. So simple subsurf modifier. And we don't really need 3 subs. We can go down to 2 subdivision levels. Smooth shaded there, and that's pretty simple, pretty much done. So now let's take a look at what we can do to start rendering this, lighting it to make it look like water, which is kind of really the focus of tonight. And then we're also going to talk about how to animate it, which is a little bit more involved. So let's go ahead and start with some basic materials and lighting. So I'm going to start really basic and just throw a point light in here. And we're going to do kind of like a backlit sort of scenario. And we'll just see how this looks. So going at it raw here from the basic Blender file setup. So I'm going to show you all the settings I would normally turn on. So jumping into the scene tab here, down to color management, we're going to switch the render view to Filmic. And that'll be default in 2.8, but right now in 2.79 it's not. So turn that on, get a little bit more accurate lighting. Let's go ahead and split our window here and jump into the node editor. And we're going to need to create a basic material for our water droplet. Okay, so let's create a new material. Call this water. And I'm going to show you kind of what this looks like as we build it live. So let's go ahead and hit Control B, and I'm going to section off this part of the window so we can render this, and hit Shift Z, and we're going to start rendering. So I'll let that update. I'm using the OpenCL engine with my AMD card, so a little slow, but okay. So we're going to need to take our point light and turn that up quite a bit. So I'm going to put this up to maybe 1,000. And it's going to be backlit right now. So because we're using a flat shaded diffuse shader on that teardrop shape for the water, we're not really seeing any definition here. So the other thing that we may want to do is, instead of using a pure black background here, we may want to change this to something that's got a little bit more of a definition here, and turn the strength up a little bit. So something like that to give us a little bit more contrast in our scene. And now let's take a look at some options for some water type materials. So to get started, the simplest way to do water is with a glass shader. And so if we plug this in, what this is basically going to do for us automatically right out of the box is that it's going to make us take an object, add some transparency to it. We can turn the roughness up to get a little bit more of a frosted effect on the surface, the way you would glass, for the glass shader, obviously. And then the really important setting here for getting a realistic looking transparency is index of refraction. So typical index of refraction values for glass are the default value here, 1.45. If we're looking at water, I believe that the index of refraction we need to be looking at is 1.5. So let me look that up real fast. I'm just Googling index of refraction water. And okay, so water is actually 1.33, I believe. But let me double check that real quick. Yeah. So for water, we want to go down to 1.33. That just basically changes the way that the reflections and the refractions are passing through the material. So you can experiment with these values to get different sorts of effects with transparent materials. glass is going to have one, water will have another, amber will have another, gases could have a different one, ice has a different one. So again, you just need to look the index of refraction up online, and you'll get a ton of values that are scientifically accurate for those. So that's really all it takes to get a realistic water type material. Now, you'll notice it really doesn't look great, and that's because a lot of this has to do with the environment you put it in. So the more things that it has to reflect, the more we're going to be able to kind of make this look like realistic water. Because if you put realistic water in an environment that has nothing around it, this is kind of what you're going to get. So what I would recommend is loading in sort of a background image. So let me go ahead and jump in and find one for us to use tonight. And we're going to go to the live streaming sections. And let's take a look here. Give me 1 second here. Get to our YouTube folder. Okay, so I'm going to jump in here and see if we can find another background that we've used in the past here. Okay, I'm actually just going to go Google one real fast, and we'll just pull one off the web. So we're going to look up HDRI backgrounds. So if you've never used this website before, go ahead and get my... Okay. If you've never used this website before, it's a great website by Greg Zale, and he's an amazing Blender artist that has created our entire career really out of creating these HDR backgrounds. So he has these that you can purchase here, and if you would love to support him, I would recommend purchasing from here because he has amazingly awesome high-res backgrounds. You can also get some that are 100% free. So you can see the licenses there. Under the HDRIs, you can see all of the things that he offers and things like that. So let's see if we can find something to use. And it doesn't really matter what we have. We don't really need anything huge. We just want to find something kind of, you know, small that we can get reflections from. So I'm going to download that. And then I'm going to load that up. So the way that we're going to do this is go to our world settings here under the background. And then I want to add in a texture, environment texture. I'm going to open this up from my downloads. Look for the HDR that we just got. And we're going to plug that into our color here. And then if we turn the render back on, you're going to see that in the background. So our strength is going to control the exposure basically for this. I'm going to turn that up to 1. And now you're going to see we get a little bit more of a realistic look for our water droplet here. So nothing revolutionary. We're just looking at a way to kind of get this into place. And if we want to, we can go under our film settings, turn on transparent, and that will turn off the background for us. There we go. Okay. So glass by itself is one way to go about, excuse me, is one way to go about getting realistic looking water. Now, there are other ways of doing this sort of manually. So before we get into more, advanced sort of things tonight, let's talk about how I would go about building a custom cycle shader for water. And I'm just going to basically take the glass shader and we're going to split that apart into separate elements because there's a lot going on behind the scenes with the glass shader that are giving us this effect. And the benefit of splitting this off separately is that we have more control. Now, you can use that to your advantage to kind of speed things up. You want to know what you're doing because it can actually slow you down if you're not paying attention. But a glass shader by itself is a great way to get started if you're just looking for a quick way to create water. So that said, let's go ahead and separate this off. And I'm going to show you how to build this back up. So to create a glass shader for multiple shaders, it's pretty simple. You're going to want a refraction shader here. And you're also going to want a transparent shader. And then you're going to want a mix shader. Because blending these two things together is really what gives you the sort of transparent refraction factor that you get just from these two elements. And then the other thing that you don't see in this is the reflectivity of the light on top. So that starts to get us back to this, but it doesn't have any sort of shininess on the outside, which is what we're going to have to add next. So to control the refraction, basically you would want to go ahead and look at the light path input here. And this one looks a little scary if you've never seen it before. But basically, let me go ahead and make the window a little smaller here. You can experiment with which ones of these you want to use. We're going to use this a little bit to pass through for the next layer here, and that is going to be glossy. So we're going to duplicate the mix shader, pull that over, throw the glossy on top. Now that's going to give us our outer reflections on this, but we want to drive that using a Fresnel. So we're going to input a Fresnel or a layer weight, and I like to use the layer weight. And for this, we're going to take the facing value, throw that into the factor on top, and that's going to give us our reflections using the Fresnel technique on the outside edges. So bring the roughness down to something low and very sharp for those because it's sort of mirror-like on water. And then for the mix factor here, we're going to want to use something like Shadow Ray to speed this up a little bit. Now, depending on how you build this out, to play with different methods for speeding things up, and you can experiment for yourself. But there are ways to capitalize on the fact that these are separate values to kind of take that to your advantage for creating things. So the difficulty with glass, the glass shader by itself, is that you're always going to be calculating using, purely photorealistic glass calculations with refraction and all that sort of stuff. By using the light path node here, you have options at your disposal because you're custom mixing these two sides here, both with the refraction levels, transparency, as well as the outer reflections. You can decide to turn those on and off. You can decide to leave off the outer layer of transparency. And some of the reasons you would want to do that is not every scene needs to showcase that all the time. So if you're going to be doing a sort of water-based shader for like an ocean scene at night, maybe all you really need is the glossiness. Maybe you don't really need the refraction side of this. So you could actually just skip this entire first half of the shader building and just do a basic glossy shader with some layer weighting on a diffuse or something like that. Now, I'm not really recommending that all the time because that's too much of a generalization. You're going to have to play with this a little bit, but it can be useful to kind of take things in your own hands and kind of play around with this. So this is kind of a good way to rebuild the glass shader to get started. And again, you'd want to experiment with these values a little bit and see what's right for your scene. So tonight, that's kind of the direction we're going to head. Now let's talk a little bit about how to kind of get water going in a scene. Because if you just have a water droplet, but that by itself is not really going to be great. But we want to try to start playing with some experimentation here. So lighting is going to be a huge part of this. So we've already got our HDR in the background helping us out quite a bit. But you want some actual physical lights in your scene too to really start helping you out. So you want to kind of change some of the intensity here. So this one's at 1,000, this one's half as much, and that is going to kind of help define the sort of key we have set up here. So you can see that really punches up the reflections and the way this sort of just feels. And as we rotate around this and this cleans up, you can really start to see how that is looking here. Okay, so let's take a look at how we might want to start creating some of our animations for this in the shot. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our node editor up there at the top. Now we have our basic droplet here. I'm going to go ahead and save my scene for tonight. And let's go ahead. Create a new folder here. Okay, so there's quite a few things we can do here to start creating different types of water. We can simulate water, we can simulate rain, we can simulate the interaction using animation paths. And so one of the things I definitely want to talk about as we get started is a different type of object in Blender that lends itself to sort of liquids of any kind, and that is the meta object. So if you look under the add menu, you've got metaball, and then there's all of these options here. So if we just add a metaball to the scene, you can see it looks kind of different, a little weird if you've never played with these before. But basically, when you duplicate these and you bring them into contact with one another in these influencer circles, they interact with each other just like you would expect a liquid to interact. And basically, you can play with the settings down here or over here under the properties tab for these. But you've got resolution, you've got the threshold settings, which change some things there. The view settings are going to be kind of the render level of detail. So the lower these go, the more resolution you have to play with. You can see the wireframe updating there. And so you got two separate settings. One's the viewport setting, one's the actual render setting when you go in here to render this up. So I might lower this a little lower than the top one. For update, you've got different things here that help you keep the viewport speedy and things like that. So if you start animating these, this will help you kind of change the way that your viewport's updating. So fast will hide them, half will lower them down to half res while they're moving around, and then always will be kind of full res the whole time. So what's cool about these is that they have an automatic way of interacting, just like you would expect something liquid or water to kind of react to each other. So that's one way to create some more liquid type of effects. And then you just want to link the material for these here, and you get your water that way. So now if we were to go ahead and render that, you can see we've already got automatic sort of connections here with water droplets, and that's pretty cool. So with all of these different options, any of these will interact with each other. So if we create a plane and then put that here, we can scale this down the z-axis to get it really, really flat. And this one I might turn down to fast. But there we go, and that's going to give us some interesting interaction there. So this would all be water, and you'll notice this just intersects this mesh, so it only really works with other meta objects. But if you want to create an entire lake or something, this is kind of an interesting way to go about doing it. And there are downsides. You know, this takes up some computation on your graphics card or your CPU, but it does give you pretty much automatic surface tension, interaction, things like that with a water effect. So those are some cool options that you can do with metaballs. Now you can kind of simulate the same basic behavior by using a combination of vertex groups and on regular meshes. So let's go ahead and reposition our cursor here. I'm going to create a plane, and then I'm going to kind of drop this down. And let's just go ahead and assume this is just an entire body of water of some kind, so a lake or a river or something like that. So I'm going to copy the material over to this as well. So if we were to just render this now, you see what we have. Okay, so no interaction. Basically, the the mesh is just intersecting and going through the bottom, and that's really not what we want. We want it to feel like those meta balls kind of felt. So the way to kind of do that is to take advantage of the geometry we have here in our mesh. So what I would do is I would create a new vertex group when we are in edit mode, and then I would select those bottom vertices and I would assign those to the group here. So I'm just going to name this whatever we want to name it, assign the area that's going to come into contact with the water down here at the bottom, and let's just go ahead and assign them a weight of 1.0. And then we can go ahead and use a shrink wrap modifier. We want to target the plane down here. Now by default, it's going to use all of those vertices in the mesh, but because we have a vertex group, we're just going to use the tension here, and that's only going to shrink wrap those to the plane down below. And so we can say keep above surface. We can change the type of projection if we want. Go to project, nearest vertex, nearest surface point, and then whenever you move the droplet here, it will keep those projected down to the bottom. Now, you can offset this a little bit. So if you don't want it completely touching like that, 0.001 is all you need to get it up and off, so it's not going completely through the bottom there. And you can just dial that into whatever you want. So there we go, that's a pretty low value, but that way it's not really intersecting all the way through. And this will look a little bit more kind of like what we were after before. And so not completely mimicking the interaction you get from metaballs, but it's a little bit faster to render and lets you keep with basic foundational meshes to use there. So interesting way to do that. You could also try booleans and some other things there that would kind of make that interesting in terms of the interaction, things like that. But that's one thing you can do if you want to kind of stick this to a surface. If instead you didn't want this to be water, but you wanted it to be a different type of material, let's just go ahead and create a regular diffuse type of material here. And then let's render that. This would basically be like a water droplet rolling down the side of a table or something like that. So you can see using that shrink wrap modifier, it just makes it feel like, okay, so it's actually impacting that surface. It's not really going to be kind of going through it and ruining the effect. Because if this actually goes through the other side for the water droplet, it's going to kind of break the illusion of the reflections and the refractions in there. So if we turn off the shrink wrap modifier, you're going to see that it really kind of destroys the illusion here where it intersects that table or that plane or whatever. So if we turn this back on, you can see it definitely changes the profile of the reflections, the shadowing, all that kind of stuff on the inside, and you know, really kind of makes that feel more realistic there. Okay. So let's talk about what some of the options are for simulating real fast, and then we can see about some different ways to create some animations. So I'm going to take the water droplet effect here, and I'm going to just go ahead and throw this over to the side. We'll keep the plane where it is. I might make this a little bit bigger, apply the scale there. And then what I want to go ahead and do is create another plane. I'm going to bring this up to about here. And then let's go over to the particle effects. Now, I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about particle effects or simulations on the stream. There's a lot to dig into these topics, and it's one of those things where live it can get a little bit hard to keep this from you know, crashing and things like that. So we just have to be careful. But we're going to add a new particle system. By default, if you add a particle system and just kind of run the play button on the timeline, you'll see that it starts emitting particles from an object that you can add to the scene. Now, bear in mind when you create a particle system, it's attached to an object. So we went ahead and created a plane here. So I'm just going to scale that up and apply the scale so we're back at 1 to 1. And now when we go ahead and play, you can see from every sort of face here on the surface, it's going to emit those particles. Now there's a lot of settings to dig in here. We're not going to get into all of these tonight, but you can use this to help you simulate rain effects and things like that for your particles. So this is different from some of the other particle settings we have under physics. You've got soft bodies, which can be used to kind of simulate things like liquid. You've also got fluid, which is meant to simulate things like buckets of water and other types of fluid. You would think like toothpaste, anything that's liquid of any kind would be considered fluid. Honey, milk, anything that flows. So those are kind of your options for simulating that. And then you've got a whole lot of other custom things you can do with just meshes to sort of emulate the way fluids move, which we'll talk about as well. So starting with just the particle effects, we can go through here and we can crank the number of particles up as this is running. So you can kind of see, we can add our own number here. Start off small. You don't need to get tons of particles in here to make things start happening. Now you'll notice these aren't falling all the way down and hitting our mesh. They're basically falling and then kind of disappearing here. That's because our lifetime value is only at 50. So if we start to turn this up, you're going to see these will last longer and longer in the scene until they are finally going through and ending right about here. So let's just maybe turn this up to something like 120. Maybe not even that much, maybe 80. Okay, that's about perfect actually. So we're going to turn the lifetime value up to that. That will at least get them all the way through the mesh here for our plane. You'll notice also that the particles are not interacting with our mesh. So to get that to work, we actually need to select our plane here. And under the physics tab, we need to turn on collision for this. So let's turn on collision, and you'll notice now that our particles should be interacting with our mesh here. Now, they're not looking like water. They're not really interacting the way we want them to, but that's because we have to dial these settings in. So let's go back to selecting our plane under the particle tab here. And so we can just keep tweaking these settings. So the start number here is, you'll notice every time it loops back around the timeline, it starts emitting on frame 1 and it stops emitting on frame 200. So right around here, it'll run out of particles to emit, and it'll loop back around and do that. So if we go all the way to 250, it should be emitting raindrops the entire time our simulation's running down the timeline. You can also change where the sort of particles are emitted from, vertices, faces, or an entire volume. So we'll just leave this the way it is right now. You can bake this so that you're not simulating this live, which becomes really necessary when you start dealing with lots of particles, or you start to deal with particle meshes, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And you've also got lots of physics to play with. So if you look at things like normal, the reason these are falling down and being emitted this way is because this value is set to 1. So if you turn this down to 0, you're going to notice that it affects the way these are being emitted. And you're also going to notice that because we have a gravity turned on, a gravity field turned on automatically, that it is affecting things as well. So if we look under field weights, you'll notice the gravity effect is turned all the way up to 1. If we turn that down to 0, you'll notice that these basically get emitted and they just kind of start floating. Now, because we have normal turned down to 0, those are not going to move off the plane at all. If we turn this up to 1, they'll get emitted off the surface normal of our plane. So we talk about face normals when we're modeling. And currently this plane is pointed up, so you'll notice that these are being emitted up. Now if we rotate this plane 180 degrees, these will then start to be emitted downward. And so you can think of this as if we turn the gravity all the way to 0, we're now kind of in outer space. These are being emitted the way that you would expect sort of particles to float around in space there. So let's turn the gravity all the way back up. Let's turn the normal, well, we'll leave the normal where it is right now. That's fine. Turn on rotation. We'll play with that. And then we want to play a little bit with maybe some other physics. So Newtonian physics are fine. You can turn on fluid and play a little bit more with how this looks and things like that. And so that may bounce a little bit more, a little bit less, things like that. You've got drag, you've got mass and things like that. So there's a lot of things that control the way this feels. The drag here is going to be the air drag that you see, which will slow these down a little bit as they fall. And so they're going to fall a little bit slower there. You've also got dampening, which kind of does the same sort of thing when they fall. So if you turn that way up, they're not really going to fall at all. But a little bit of dampening here is going to give you some wind resistance, things like that. So you get die on hit, you turn that on, those are going to be basically just turned off as soon as they contact the surface here for collision. And so all of these things can be used in conjunction with one another to create special type of effects. So if we're going to want to create water here, we go down to the fluid properties. We've got stiffness, viscosity. That's basically the thickness of our fluid here. So one of the things we want to definitely change is the fact that we don't want these bouncing like rubber balls off the bottom of this plane here. So we can change the interaction. So if we turn on, let's take that off, take the stiffness, maybe turn that up. Okay, so that's not really doing anything for us. One of the other things you want to think about is your collision object. So if we right click on that and go back over to our physics, we've got stickiness. We can turn that up some, and that will change how these are sticking to our object here. So now when they fall, they bounce a little bit, but they're more likely to kind of stay towards the ground. We've got friction. Turn a little bit of that up as well. Particle dampening. So all those things are going to contribute to how much those kind of fall off. Now, here's something interesting as well. Currently, this plane is set to sort of just flat. So they're falling, they're landing, and basically nothing is really else being done to these particles. If we turn this in space, when they fall, they're going to start kind of dripping down to the bottom here. Now, remember our lifetime for these particles is not very high. So if we go back up to the top here, we set these to something like 200. That's going to give these particles a longer time to kind of fall and kind of space themselves out and things like that. Now, this is where you're going to have to play a little bit with all these settings. These are collecting, and the friction's up higher probably than we need it to be on this. So I want to turn this down. And that will let these slide and kind of move a little further, as well as the stickiness. Let's turn that down a little bit here. Okay, so we don't really want them bouncing that high, so let's pull this up some. Turn down that dampening so we're not getting these slowing down a little bit. So they're kind of trickling down there. Permeability will control the chance that these go through the mesh, which we really don't ever want to happen here. So I'm going to turn that all the way down. But there we go. Okay, so I'm going to bring this a little lower so it doesn't take these forever to hit the bottom of our plane. And then I'm going to move this up. So we start sort of up here. And basically what I want to create is sort of the idea that this This is sort of like a rain bar, and all of these little droplets are starting up here and they're kind of trickling down the side of this plane. So I'm going to up the particle count here, change the life of each of these, and then we'll just keep playing with these settings till we kind of get what we want. These emission values over here will kind of change the direction these are being emitted. So if we want to kind of aim these this way, we would want to kind of turn up the Y value a little bit. So you can kind of see if we turn this up to something like a 1 and it loops back around, it'll kind of start shooting these down this way. Okay, so that's going to go that way. We want to go the opposite direction, so let's go negative. Okay. So we're kind of getting there. Let's go back to the particle settings, and I don't want these really bouncing like that. So we could play with the mass, which would change sort of how heavy these are. Turn this up. See what that does. We can change the springs here. One of the other things you can do here is turn up the number of subframes, which will change how these are calculated between each of these frames down here, and this will sometimes give you just more accurate results if you turn those up. But anyways, this is how you would start to use particles to create these liquid effects. Now, something to note is that these by themselves, these little particles that are being emitted, are really not visible when you render because they're not using materials or anything like that. Your emitter will be visible, but if we just render this right now, it's really not going to be something that you can kind of see. And again, that's because we haven't set anything up to be representative of these particles. It's basically just simulating these points in space. So what we need to do is give these particles a look. So if we check the display settings here, you're going to see that we have sort of these options here. And by default, we've got none, we've got rendered, we've got point, circle, cross, and that will kind of change just the representation in this 3D viewport here for us. So rendered is by default what it's set at. That's the first part of creating something that we can actually see when we render. The other thing is under the render tab here. It's going to say default material. This is going to be whether or not we see the plane that these are emitted from. So if we turn this off and we render this section here with this plane, and we have this emitter unchecked, you're not going to see where those are coming from. So you can turn that on and off. And you can also pick what we're going to see here. So if you want to just have some stand-in objects, you've got things here you can use. You've got halo, you've got lines. You can see that there. Depending on the size that you create, you can start to notice these popping in. but you'd have to play with these a little bit to see what that looks like. Now, ultimately, basically, we want to create our own stand-in objects for these, and to do that, we can use our little droplet that we created here. So what I'm going to do, because we're going to be emitting thousands of these, is I want to go ahead and turn the subdivisions down pretty low, like 1 here. And once we do that, we can go ahead, jump back into the particle settings, and I'm going to pick an object, and we're going to pick droplet, and that's what is going to be emitted there. So now when we simulate this, you should see that it uses the droplet here for our objects. Now, to play with these settings a little bit to see what this is looking like here. Okay, so it's not really popping on like it should. One of the other things we could use here is a group. So let's just see what happens if we move this to layer 2 here. Let's hit Control G to assign this a group. I'll just name this water. Switch back into first layer here. Let's switch this over to group. We'll pick water, and then we'll just say use the whole group. Okay, so let's look at our settings here. Turn these back down for a second just so we can get our settings placed back and kind of evaluate what's going on here. Okay. Okay, so yeah, that's weird. Okay, so we're seeing these when we render. We're not seeing these when we are in the 3D viewport, which is kind of odd. But So just so we can kind of see these a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and do a cache of the simulation, which is going to kind of bake all of our animation data in here. So let's jump into the cache settings here, and let's turn off the render and just click bake real fast. And that's basically going to just permanently kind of get these set up so where those are in place, and now we can go ahead and just play back the entire simulation without having to worry about what this is all looking like. Okay. So basically it's using the object that we created earlier, this teardrop sort of water object, to create these raindrop effects, and those are falling down the plane, and then those are kind of moving into place. Now it's using all the physics that we created before, and you'll see once you cache things, it's going to start graying all of this out, so you can't really change anything anymore. But if you want to kind of get all those options back, just free the bake, and then you can kind of play with the options here for rotation and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's bake this one more time. Okay, so with damping turned up as far as we have it here, these aren't really getting too far. So a little bit of damping will go a long way, and we can actually just update all to frame, which will bake it up to the last frame we have here. And depending on where you have this, it will just kind of update the simulation based on your settings, wherever you want this to be. So it could be a little bit quicker of a way than baking the entire thing. But right now we're basically just taking solid objects, dropping them down. They look like raindrops, but they're not acting like raindrops. And this is where you get into actually simulating fluid. So instead of using particles to do that, what you'd want to do is simulate fluids. So this is where we get into, instead of using the particle settings, we'll uncheck that, and we'll instead create a fluid object. Now, fluids are a bit more involved in the sense that there's more to more settings and more to consider here, but basically it's the same in the sense that you're going to simulate the fluid just like you simulated the particles. So we're going to turn this into a fluid here, and then you've got all of these options for how you want to create this. So we could try particle first and then use our fluid particles here, and we got all of these settings here for what we would want to use. So we get a group, check off water, pick the whole group, and there we go. Okay, so we can get drops, we can check that off, turn up the size there, and then you've got all these settings here for those. So to play a little bit with the way this would work, so let's go ahead and simulate here. I'm going to pause and then let's render. Okay. Okay. So let's instead use something like an outflow. And to get a fluid kind of working, you need to have a domain, which is the entire area like the simulation is happening inside of. So we'll create a little box to hold our fluid simulation. And for this, we can just change the draw type to bounding. Okay. And this will kind of simulate the container for our fluid. So we're going to apply the scale here. We're going to add a fluid, and now we're going to add a domain here for what this will look like. Switch back to particle. Bake the fluid simulation and see what happens. Let's check off collision and make this an obstacle. So inflows will add liquid to the scene, outflows will take them away. And if we want to go ahead and set this up, let's duplicate this plane here, put it beneath this object. And let's make this an outflow. Okay, I'm gonna go back here and let's rebake this. This is always a little tricky to get set up correctly the first time from scratch. So if you're having trouble like I am tonight setting this up from scratch, one of the things you can actually do is go to add and create a custom object, and there's presets basically. So let's see if we can find where these are. Okay, so you're gonna go to Object Quick Effects, and you've got Fur, Explode, Smoke, Fluid. So if you click Fluid, select an object, and that's gonna go ahead and automatically set that up for you. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a third layer here. Let's zoom in on this and create a fluid effect here. So okay, So by setting that up automatically, you can't have more than one object in your scene that's set up to be a domain. So if you've already tried to create a simulation before, you got to get rid of that. But basically start off with a cube and just add in that object, quick effects, fluid, and you can get going in the right direction for this. Fluid is one of those things I don't experiment with a lot, and so again, you got to set it up the right way or it's really not going to work for you. But this is a really quick way to do it, just so I can get you guys an example of what this looks like. So we're letting this bake right now at the top. And now you can see basically takes the entire object that we have on the outside edges when it simulates and creates fluid from the boundaries of that object. So this is how you get a much more interactive type fluid that simulates water or really any kind of fluid that you can imagine. And all of that's based on automatic settings as far as your viscosity and things like that you can dial in, and that will change the the thickness of your liquid. And one of the biggest things that influences what this looks and feels like is your scale. So scene scale here, as well as your resolution settings, are going to be really important to dial in what this is looking like. So that is kind of what you would need to use for getting fluid in place. Now what we can do here is our original domain object out here has been simulated, and so it's not looking like the big bounding box that we had out here a minute ago. It's going to be baked in as this fluid, but we start with something like this. So if instead we make this an inflow, then we can go ahead and bake this again. And what this should do now is start sort of adding water to the scene, kind of like a water faucet would. So let's see what happens. And if you guys want me to, I can go ahead and do a much more detailed breakdown of how fluids work in the future in a tutorial or something like that. But for now, I figured this would be a good introduction for you guys into how this kind of works. There's a lot of experimentation you would need to do to get the effects you're after, but again, this is just kind of an introduction tonight for how to start playing with this. So, real downside with simulations like this, smoke, anything like this, is going to be the bake times, which these are low settings, but if you start cranking this up, this could take hours and hours to do. So now you can see this is more like what you get with a raindrop type of effect. It starts to kind of drip these throughout the scene, and there you go. So creating those, if we now go back into the material and we pick water, and we were to render this, we go back and grab our little lamps here from the first layer, pull those in. So now you can kind of see what that is looking like. So I'd probably turn up the resolution here on the bake. So if we look at our settings over here, we've got our final resolution at about 65. But you'd want to turn this up to something higher than that. So bear in mind also that our viewport is displaying the preview setting here. So when we change this up to final, we're going to get a bit more of a cleaner render of this higher setting here. So for our final, we might crank this up to something like 120. And I'll go ahead and simulate that, and let's see how fast we can do this. It may take a little bit longer. But just to show you guys that you can get some pretty detailed simulations just by turning up the resolution here. Now again, like I said, depending on what effect you're going for, you'd really want to take different approaches for building out your fluids. So if you're going to use something that's small and close up, this is a great way to create those fluid effects. But if you're going to do something that's a little bit bigger in scale, such as flooding an entire area, there's a limit to which that will be what you want to go with. I would recommend using probably a combination of some manual with the automatic um, sort of simulation options to make that work best for you. So trying to basically just take one method, throw that as the entire solution at your problem is rarely going to work without tons of tweaking, tons of time dialing that in. So remember that you can always cheat the system and use whatever little technique and advantage you can get to speed things up or just make this easier on yourself. As far as getting bigger simulations going, there's also an ocean modifier that we can explore in the modifier palette, which will automatically create a surface level ocean on a plane. And it's already been set up to kind of do all those settings and dial that in for you, and you can get waves and things like that. So there's lots of options. There's also plugins you can start using to kind of dial in what you want to get out of your water that are a lot more sophisticated than the built-in tools in Blender. They can get kind of expensive, but again, if fluid is your thing and you want to use that for a lot of simulations and things like that, it can be worth the money, especially if you're going to make money from this using it for client work, things like that. So let's check up on our simulation. So you can see just by cranking this up to 120, roughly double of what we had here before, this is taking quite a bit longer to bake here. So the upside with Blender's current UI is that you can actually keep working on stuff while this is baking. That wasn't always the case. In fact, if you try to do this in previous versions, it would just kind of lock your system up. But thankfully, we are not there anymore. So I wouldn't try to do anything too heavy while this is baking, but because bear in mind it is using processing power on your CPU. But you can go ahead and still keep moving around and, play around with stuff. Okay, so let's talk about some other options for what we can do to create water effects while this is going. So I'm going to go back to layer 1 here. Let's go ahead and create another sort of droplet. Okay, and I'll create a cube. We'll just model another quick droplet because I think I deleted the other one. Okay, so this is where we get into some more of the manual types of setups you might have for how these are kind of working. And if you wanted to create some interesting effects like droplets on a window or something like that, we can talk about how to sort of animate that. Now, you can obviously do it using particles. If you dial in the settings perfectly and all of that, you can get that set up to work kind of automatically, which could be quick. It just depends on, how much time you have and how well you are able to dial those in. If you want to do it a little bit more manually, let's say you wanted some more manual control over what that kind of looked like, then there are some ways to go about doing that. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that would work. So I'm going to there we go. Just trying to see what I was doing there. I'm going to delete our little particle generators over here. Now this is going to be like a pane of glass. So what I'm going to do is take this, I'm going to extrude it a little bit so we have some thickness there. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a new material. And well, right now let's just keep it where it was. So I'm going to undo that. Put this back in a material here. And we're going to talk about how to get this dialed in here. So let's rotate this around. So we're going top to bottom here. And let's talk about how we would want to kind of animate this down the window pane. So we're going to use something called animation curves to do this. And before we do that, let's jump back over to layer 3 and take a look at our higher resolution water droplets here. So by turning that resolution up, as you can see, we're getting much higher levels of surface resolution on the droplets themselves, as well as when they impact the surface of our water down at the bottom here. So again, if you go to render this, it's going to look a little bit better each time when you start to simulate the way this looks. Now, it looks a little weird right now because we don't have the background turned on. So if you take this off, as far as the transparent background goes, it's going to look a little bit more like it should. Because remember, these are all see-through sort of objects. This is also still pretty low res, so if you wanted to, you could go ahead and add a subsurf modifier on top of this, which would kind of smooth these out even more and give you just a much better sense of sort of what the water would look like if it were smoothed out. So yeah, anyways, there's a lot more involved in trying to get realistic looking water, but this is basically something you can do to experiment on your own and just get started, which is kind of what the point of tonight is. So I'm going to take off that subsurf. Let's go back to layer 1 and let's talk about this alternative method here. First, let's invert those normals and set the proper material up for this water droplet. Okay, now what I'm going to do is go ahead and add in a curve. I'm going to use a path object. Scale this up. Okay, so start at the top. We're going to end down here somewhere. And the path object's great because you don't really have to worry about direction so much of, you know, handles and all that kind of stuff. You basically just create sort of segments in the middle. You can subdivide this up and then just create your own little path of how this droplet is going to fall down the sort of object here. Now, you don't have this sort of projected onto the surface here, so you can kind of project that manually if you want, using your project commands for these vertices, but you can also use a modifier. So we're going to use, again, this shrink wrap. We're going to select our window object there, and this is going to project in a negative direction. And I'm going to move this up until it starts off above this entire pane and then project straight down. So that's great because now whenever we go ahead and are kind of creating the path here, we don't really have to worry about the space as long as we're kind of looking straight down on this. We can just subdivide and then kind of decide how we want to move this around. Safe in the knowledge that it's going to project this kind of straight down for us on our objects. So if you want sharp turns, bunch these up close together. And if you want more jagged turns and whatever, you can do that. So this is sort of what you would expect to see if these were droplets kind of streaking by in a window in a car, a windshield, something like that. And that's kind of what we're shooting for here. So something kind of erratic, some sharp turns, speed up, slow down, things like that. And you get a weird looking path like this. Now, we can parent our droplet object to the path here with Control P. And you can say follow path. And then when you play this animation, it will follow this, this path here. Okay, so there we go. So one thing we're going to want to do is recenter this object so that it starts where it is on the path here. And we're going to use that same technique we used before to project this surface onto the flat part of this plane. So I'm going to rotate this as much as I can to where it's kind of in line with this object. We're going to select what we need to have in place for the geometry here, which is going to be everything on the lower portion of this object. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in our vertex group. We're going to assign a weight of 1. And then under the modifier tab, let's go ahead and add in a shrink wrap, pick our windowsill or whatever this is going to be, use our vertex group, and we will drop this down something kind of like that. Okay, so let's play with our settings here a little bit. Jump into our path settings for our animation path. And let's see. So I'm going to take our shrink wrap modifier that we currently have on our curve and just go ahead and apply that. And that will make our water droplet sort of start in the right place there. And that's what we want. Okay, so now you can kind of see it follows that path all the way down the length of our windowsill. You can play with sort of the timing of this. If you look at the frames, you want to set that to something like 250, which would be the entire length of our timeline here. And that way it takes that long to get all the way down to the bottom there. So I'm going to scale that up a little bit. Apply the scale and the rotation there. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take our little preview render here. I'm going to put these out to the side. I'm going to turn these up quite a bit. So now, I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of trickling down and following this path, as you can see here. So again, you stack a few of these up, change the paths around a little bit, and all of a sudden you've got some really interesting methods for creating these water droplet effects. There's a lot more we get into with using dynamic paint and things like that to leave trails of water behind and all sorts of stuff like that. But these are some basic things that you can use to create some of these water effects. So let's talk about some other things that have to do with water that were requested from one of our guild members. And that has to do with, we talked about droplets, we talked about waves, ripples, things like that with the simulation. But let's talk about some other types of liquid effects that you can use the same basic principles for. So something like bubbles. Let's talk about how to simulate the look of bubbles, and that goes back into sort of these shader type of effects we have that we talked about earlier on. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new UV sphere. We'll just scale this up quite a bit. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new material from the water material. So I'm just going to hit this little sign here to make it a new material. We'll call this bubbles. And let's take a look at how to differentiate our bubble material so that it doesn't look like water. So if we just render this right now, turn our smooth shading on, we can see that we've got our water material. So to create the bubble effect, what we need to do is change some of the properties around so the surface looks a little different. So what I'm going to do is pull up another search here. We're going to search bubble index of refraction. And let's just see if there's a difference here. Okay, so it's pretty much the same as water. We got a 1.33257. So we're going to leave this the same. Maybe 1.332. And the real trick here for the bubbles are the way that this surface kind of looks a little different as far as the color goes. So if I just look up bubbles and we go to images under Google, let me pull one of these up so we can kind of see what this looks like. Okay, so you can see right here that the bubble is sort of transparent like glass would be, but the outside is really what indicates to us that this is a bubble. It makes it feel like a bubble, and it's sort of the dispersion of the refractions and things on the outside that are sort of giving this rainbow type of effect. So how you can start approaching that is by altering the type of refraction that we're getting here with the color. So you can see here that we've got a basic white color going in for the index of refraction here, but you can actually mix several of these together to get different kinds of refraction here on the surface. So I'm going to turn up our preview render settings here. So let me go under sampling and turn this up to maybe 128 here, just so this will start refining a little bit more in the 3D viewport. And so there you go. All right, so the key here is really to pay attention to how we have our options in these refractions that we can change. So the color is one of the key things we're going to play with, as well as our index of refraction values here. So to get sort of a prism type of effect, it's pretty simple. Basically, you're just going to go with the three primary colors, red, green, and blue. And we're going to add those back together to create a sort of prism type of effect. Now, bubbles are not going to exactly follow those types of patterns because they're a little bit more unique in the way they're dispersed, but this is kind of the effect you would use if you wanted to create sort of a realistic diamond or something like that. So let's just kind of look at this first, and I'll show you what this kind of looks like. So the key here is the way that these are added back together. So we're going to use an add shader. And then from this add shader, we're going to plug these all back in here and replace our refraction. So if you look at the surface, this is kind of what starts to give you that breakup as far as the color breakup for this. And to dial this in so it looks a little bit more specific, you'd want to change the index of refraction values for each of these slightly so that they are kind of different proportional refraction based on the wavelength of the color. So for the blue, we might go 1.331. The red, we might leave where it is, and for the green, we might go 1.333. And just by changing a thousandth of of the difference there on the number for the index of refraction, it kind of starts to give us some interesting little breakup effects there. Now, the more you change the refraction spread between these values, the more you're going to start getting some really varied breakups here on the surface. So if we start changing it that much, you're going to start seeing a lot of variation there on the surface as far as that goes. And remember, we're still just using one type of color for each of these index of refractions, and then plugging those all back into add shaders, combining those together, and then putting that back into the mix shader. So really the only thing we've done here is instead of just passing white through here, for every little index of refraction or every little refraction from light that's passing through this bubble, we're now adding back in the different colors based on different slight angles of light changing through those reflections. So that's one option. The other thing you can do to get this a little bit more varied on top of that is to experiment with the type of patterning that you have here. So instead of just plugging primary colors into these, you'll notice also with this reference here that with the bubble, we got some weird little rainbow type of swirls going on the surface. So again, that is something that is a variable that we can kind of change around here. So if we look at the way these are swirling around, if we take a texture node and plug that into some of these color outputs, we can change that around. So let's start with something like noise. And we'll just plug the factor in on the surface so we can kind of take a look at that. And distortion is what's going to kind of create this weird ripply type of pattern here. So I'm going to take the scale down a little bit. And now what we want to do is we got sort of a black and white map here. Let's go ahead and take a converter color ramp, sort of a gradient. We'll take this blue color and we'll plug it into one side. And on the other side, we can take another color and kind of shift it towards sort of a third color like that. And maybe we'll go purple. And then we'll plug that factor into this and then pass that back through to the color. And then we'll have the same basic effect for all of these. So we could use the same basic principle, but instead we're going to use red for the left side. And then we might go a little bit more towards a yellow. Take that factor, go into the color. And it's really just about experimenting, you know, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and taking the time to play around a bit. Okay, so these are all using the same basic texture input, but you'll see as we change this back over to the final material, we're getting a lot more rainbow type breakup on the surface the way you would with a bubble. And let me go ahead and just do kind of a more finalized render so you can really see what this looks like. So delete that node there. Okay, let's add in a camera. And let's do a okay. We'll do a render right here. I'm going to pop this into a new window so we can see this. Hey Lorenzo, see you in the chat. Thanks for dropping in, man. So, not sure how long you've been there, but we're working on water tonight. So let me go ahead and cancel this one render, and I'm going to start this one over again. Come on. Go and save. Okay, so new window, render. Okay, so this should give us a little bit better version of how this looks with a cleanup. And actually what I'm going to do as well is turn on denoising. So let's go under the render layers, check off denoising. We'll just leave the default settings, and then let's go this again. Okay. Come on. Okay, there we go. So denoising is great because it's going to kind of clean up those blurry refraction edges as we get in here and keep this going. But hopefully it'll kind of show you kind of that dispersion pattern on the surface of this bubble and just demonstrate what that looks like. So you can see between water, glass, bubbles, there's really not a lot of difference there. And that sort of noise pattern is coming from the denoising because it's trying to clean up too much. But as far as the basic node settings, there's some differences. You know, there's some things you got to tweak, but overall, it's kind of the same principle. So there's a lot you can do to really spice this up, get it looking more realistic. But it just takes time, you know. And once you understand the basic principles, it's not too hard to go from there to something that feels a lot more advanced, just because it only takes a couple of nodes to really, you know, get in there and tweak things. So, anyways, I hope that's helped a little bit, kind of clear up some of the maybe mystery surrounding water experimentation. Um, there's a lot more we can go into about effects, but if you take these basic principles like this, then it'll take you a long way. You can start rendering things that look realistic, especially if you're not going to be simulating these effects as far as animation goes. If you're just going to get the look, then this will take you a long way in terms of trying to get there. So that is something to take a look at. But combine that with the rest of the techniques that we've kind of looked at tonight, and you're really on your way to creating some interesting looking stuff. So, looking at this little water droplet effect that we have here in our 3D viewport, I'm going to go ahead and change the color of this just so it's a little easier to look at. Okay, so again, we took our path, threw it on here, and then we have our animation of this water droplet happening here. Now again, like I said, you can basically just duplicate these two objects, shift them over a little bit, and then alter these paths kind of differentiate the way these are moving, and then that's all you really need to do to get these kind of randomized a little bit. So these are going to follow completely different paths now, and again, you can do this over and over and over again, and you know, offset the time. So obviously if you take this path, you go into the animation settings under the curve, and you look at this, we have our frames covering the entire length on the first one. On this one, maybe we only have it covering you know, 200 instead of 250. So if it's only covering up to here, that means it's going to end on this frame. So starts at 0, ends at 200. Means it's going to move a little quicker than this one. So now if we play that back, you can see again, if these were streaking down a window or pane or whatever, that's kind of what would happen. And then again, you can just play with tons of these in your shot, and before you know it, you know, you've got a little animation that you can create. throw a camera on this, a little bit of depth of field, and all of a sudden you've got some interesting looking animations there. So each of these, you just give them a custom, custom value for the frames here. Water droplets are all going to move according to these paths. Now again, you're going to want to make sure these are sticking to the surface here, and because we created these with a shrink wrap modifier that we already applied, you may want to throw another shrink wrap modifier on there just to make sure those are on that surface. Or like I said, you can go ahead and snap project those onto the surface of that plane. Each of these you subdivide, add in a little bit more, and there you go. Okay, so with all of these here, again, what we might want to do at this point is take our camera, rotate it into a view like that. Let's go ahead and throw a 1920 by 1080. You'll notice the clipping is not far enough out to take into account the scale of this shot, so we need to go into our camera settings, turn this up to a higher end value for our clipping, which will go further into the scene in terms of distance. Apparently we have a really, really large scene that we're working with here. So that's how you fix that. Again, this one's dipping into a little too far. That's not what we want, so let's go ahead and throw a shrink wrap on this. Now, bear in mind that needs to start above, high enough up, that can shrink wrap by projecting down. So what I would do is just pull these points up to where they're above the surface of that object. And then that's going to reproject those back down just like that. And then when you apply that, your drop should go ahead and drop flat on that surface. So go into edit mode, pull these up to where they're just above the surface there, just like that. And then when you throw that shrink wrap on, eyedrop your plane, hit apply, and there you go. Now those should follow just like that. Okay, so let's change this over to a glass material. So let's just add a new material. We'll call this glass, and we'll just pick a simple glass shader. There we go. So we're using 2 point lights, and I'm using an HDR image environment texture. Look through our camera here, and you should be able to see kind of what that looks like. So the glass material on our surface objects, it's kind of clean right now. We've got roughness set all the way to 0. So if you want this to be a little bit more like frosted glass, you'd want to turn this up a little bit, and see it doesn't take much. 0.01 is enough to really make this feel frosted up. So you just want to go a little bit. 0.005 is enough to kind of blur the reflections a little bit, give you a sense that you're kind of maybe focusing in the foreground without having to turn on depth of field. And again, for most glass, even if it's going to be really sharp, I like to go down to a 0.002, 0.001, something like that. So we're just getting a little bit of blurriness there because no glass is usually perfect. So even a 0.001 is enough to kind of really hint at more realistic glass there. So we've got some droplets. Now the thing that's kind of missing from making this feel like it's rain is there's no droplets just kind of sitting on the glass. So what we would want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and grab the surface plane of our glass. I'm going to duplicate that and separate it by hitting P, so it's its own object. And we're not actually going to render this. This is just going to be here for us to simulate those droplets on. But basically, we're going to add a particle system. We don't want any sort of movement with these particles. They just need to sit here. But basically, we're going to emit from a faces. We want to take all the movement away. And we're going to just go ahead and turn. Yeah, I don't want those really moving much. So let's turn off our physics. And we don't need those really ending while these are we don't need the lifetime of those ending at all. So I'm just gonna play these back and you'll see hopefully we go to -50 for the start count. And you'll see a few of these popping on like this. If you didn't want that to happen, basically you would set the end value to a frame that's basically at the beginning or earlier, and then those will just be statically sitting there. If you want those to start continually popping on throughout the shot, you can just set this to equal to or greater than the end of your length of your shot here, and that will kind of make it just feel like raindrops are kind of hitting the window, which may be a little bit more accurate anyways. Okay, so we want to go down to some of these settings down here. We don't want to render the emitter, so I'm going to turn that off. Go ahead and use our water group here. Now I don't know if any of these are part of that group. So what I'm going to do is grab one of these water droplets. I'm going to add this to our water group. And then that should help us for these particle generations to use those there. Go a little bit up on the random size there. And to make sure we have all these settings set correctly so they will show up in the render. Most of these aren't going to matter with physics turned off. You're not really going to need any of these settings in here. Some of the distribution might matter depending on how you want those to pop onto your surface. But basically, group or object are the two things you kind of want to use here. Size is one of those things you kind of want to play with. So you can see that it's kind of bringing those up a little bit higher. You want these to be roughly the same size as your animated droplets. So I would say maybe a 0.8, and we can randomize, you know, what those look like a little bit more. But basically, those are now projected onto the surface of this object, and we turned our emitter off, so that duplicate pane of glass or that plane that we created is gone. So we're just left with those water droplets there. So the only thing left to really kind of think about here is the trail that we have of the water here. So you'll see these are kind of moving around and not really where we want them. Okay, so it looks like those are still moving. Let's turn off gravity. Let's see. Let's make sure all of our velocity settings are down and off. It looks like they are. No physics. We don't really want anything affecting these. So if I turn the all factor down to 0, really should be all we need to make sure those are not going to be rendered. Okay, so I'm thinking that because they're animating down those paths, that's why these are moving. So what I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to duplicate this object. I'm going to move it off to the side. I'm going to get rid of the shrink wrap. I'm going to clear the parent with Alt-P and keep the transformation. And then I'm going to take this object and I'm going to remove it from that group. So now it should just be using this one object that we have here off to the side. And those are going to stay where they are. So as we move around, those are not dropping, because they're not following those paths anymore. Okay, so let's move that back to the center of our world. We're going to clear the location. I'm going to apply the rotation. The scale's good, and we're going to move that to a new layer, so that's hidden. There we go. Okay, so now those are applied. And okay, so there we go. Okay, so like I said, there's more we could do here. We've got dynamic paint options. This is going to be too lengthy to get into tonight, but dynamic paint basically will allow you to do things like when you're animating and you're having one object interact with another, you could do things like having somebody step through the snow and leave footprints or tracks. You could also have somebody on a fogged up mirror in your bathroom or something. You could have somebody run their finger through the middle of the steam and leave a trail, or something like this where you've got water droplets falling down. You would basically create a dynamic paint object, and it would use these objects to kind of leave trails here. So that's going to be kind of it for tonight. I'm going to play around with the dynamic paint a little bit, but I don't think we're going to get it working before I sign off. So if I don't, thank you guys so much for joining me tonight in the stream. It's a little bit different tonight, but hopefully each one of these live streams gives you a little bit of a taste of what Blender is capable of. And as always, it's always more fun when you guys get here and interact with me, and we can chat about what's happening and what you guys want to do. So, hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me play a little bit with this dynamic paint. So, if you look over this, it says add a procedural operation effect to the active object. So let's click dynamic paint. You can see we've got canvas and we've got brush. So for canvas, say we've got a canvas here. It's got a surface. And let's say we grab our droplet here. Click dynamic paint. It's a brush. Add a brush. Okay. So our dynamic paint is added to the surface of our extra mesh that we generated. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. We want to add it to our window pane. So let's go ahead and add it here as a canvas. You've got image sequence or vertex. And So these are different types of surfaces that we can create. We've got waves, we've got weights. So that's another example of something that dynamic paint can interact with is water. So if you want to have a boat kind of leaving wakes, you can use dynamic paint to drive those. And we got displacement, we got paint. Paint is really kind of what you want, because for this we would probably use something like displacement mapping, or yeah, just a difference in texture to kind of simulate with the way those look instead of actually generating water. We've got dynamic paint outputs. Let's jump into the UV image editor. And let's take a look at what we have here. Let's try drip and see what that does. So let's just click bake. And I'm going to turn off all my palettes here. Yeah, so you can see there's quite a few options with the way this dynamic paint thing works. So probably not going to be able to get into a lot of this tonight. Like I was saying, there's a lot to cover here, but you can play with this a little bit, get into the Blender manual, look up some of the settings here and how to use that. And maybe at some point we'll circle back around. I'll do a tutorial or something like that on how this works, and we can play with it. Okay. So guys, that's it for me tonight. I appreciate you guys dropping in and joining me. And like I said, every Friday nights I do these at 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Right around there. Sometimes we go over, sometimes we go early. It just depends on kind of what's going on. So tonight we had water effects. This will be up as a recording in the next couple of hours. YouTube will have this back up on the channel, so you guys can watch this if you came in late. But no worries if you came in late. That's totally cool. And we definitely chat later about anything you guys want to talk about. So I'll be back next week with another one of these. Currently working on a lot of stuff. If you are a guild member, you're gonna see some new things start to pop up in the guild as far as course material and things like that. I'm gonna be releasing sort of an inner circle type of course that's just for guild members, and that's going to give you guys some week-to-week updates on what I'm working on behind the scenes. So instead of me having to just kind of promise things are coming later, you guys should hopefully be able to see some updates directly from me about courses and things like that inside the guild, and then you guys can chat with me there about what is happening. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Always fun to talk to you guys and see what's going on Friday nights. And so hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with another one. And until then, happy blending. See you later.